The morning sun cast long shadows across the abandoned streets of downtown Phoenix as Madison Torres adjusted her tactical vest and checked her ammunition count for the third time. The former Marine sergeant had never imagined she'd be leading a group of civilian women into what the military brass called Operation Reclaim. But desperate times had reshaped everyone's expectations. Behind her, 7 other women from vastly different backgrounds prepared for what could be their final mission together. Jessica Williams, a kindergarten teacher from suburban Denver, nervously gripped a modified crossbow while whispering prayers under her breath. Her hands trembled slightly, but her eyes held a determination that had surprised everyone during their 3 weeks of intensive training. Beside her, Dr. Amanda Rodriguez methodically organized medical supplies in her backpack, her surgeon's precision evident in every calculated movement. The trauma surgeon had volunteered immediately when the call went out for the experimental all-female strike team, knowing that traditional military units had struggled against the infected hordes that now controlled major population centers across the Southwest. The zombie outbreak had begun 6 months earlier in a research facility outside Las Vegas, spreading with terrifying efficiency through Nevada, Arizona, and parts of California. Unlike the shambling corpses of horror movies, these infected retain much of their physical capabilities while losing all higher brain function, making them incredibly dangerous predators driven purely by an insatiable hunger for human flesh. Government forces had managed to contain the spread to some degree, but entire cities remained under quarantine, their populations either evacuated, infected, or worse. Intelligence reports suggested that nearly 50,000 infected roamed the Phoenix metropolitan area alone, having overwhelmed the initial military response through sheer numbers and relentless aggression. The infected showed no fear, felt no pain, and never tired, making conventional warfare tactics largely ineffective against their unpredictable swarm behavior. Captain Rebecca Stone, their military liaison, had explained the mission parameters during their final briefing the night before. The team's objective was to infiltrate the Phoenix Convention Center, where survivors had reportedly barricaded themselves on the upper floors with critical research data about the outbreak's origin. Previous rescue attempts by standard military units had failed catastrophically, with entire platoons disappearing into the infected-controlled downtown area. Military strategists theorized that smaller, more agile teams might succeed where larger forces had failed, and the decision to field an all-female unit stemmed from emerging intelligence suggesting the infected responded differently to women, possibly due to pheromone variations or behavioral patterns that researchers didn't fully understand. The theory remained largely untested, making Madison's team both pioneers and potential martyrs in the fight against humanity's newest existential threat. Among the team members, former police detective Lisa Chen brought urban combat experience and an intimate knowledge of Phoenix's street layout, having patrolled these same neighborhoods for 8 years before the outbreak. Her partner, firefighter Maria Santos, possessed unmatched skills in navigating dangerous buildings and extracting people from seemingly impossible situations. The duo had worked together during the chaotic early days of the outbreak, saving dozens of civilians before the military established the quarantine perimeter. Rounding out the group were software engineer Jennifer Park, whose technical expertise would prove crucial for accessing the convention center's security systems, and former Army medic Patricia Johnson, whose battlefield experience complemented Dr. Rodriguez's surgical skills perfectly. The infected had demonstrated disturbing evolutionary adaptations over the past 6 months, developing pack hunting behaviors and primitive communication through guttural sounds and gestures. Recent reconnaissance had revealed that they'd begun setting crude traps and ambushes, suggesting some form of collective learning that terrified military analysts. The creatures retained enough motor function to climb, run, and manipulate simple tools, while their enhanced aggression and pain immunity made them formidable opponents even for trained soldiers. Most unsettling was their apparent ability to coordinate attacks across large areas, with infected groups responding to distant sounds or disturbances as if connected by some invisible network that scientists struggled to explain. Madison's team had trained relentlessly at a secure facility in Colorado, learning to move silently through urban environments, communicate through hand signals, and engage infected targets with maximum efficiency while minimizing noise that might attract larger groups. They'd studied hours of combat footage, learning to recognize the subtle behavioral patterns that might provide split-second advantages in life-or-death encounters. Each woman had proven herself capable of making the hard choices that survival demanded, though none could predict how they'd perform when facing the infected in their own territory. The psychological pressure of fighting creatures that had once been human neighbors, friends, or family members had broken many seasoned soldiers, and the team's mental resilience would be tested as severely as their physical capabilities. As they approached the quarantine perimeter's edge, Madison felt the familiar pre-combat mixture of fear and anticipation coursing through her system. The abandoned suburbs stretched before them like a concrete graveyard, with overturned vehicles, shattered windows, and ominous dark stains marking the locations of humanity's last desperate stands. In the distance, the Phoenix skyline rose like a monument to civilization's fragility, its empty towers now serving as vertical hunting grounds for creatures that had once called those same buildings home. The mission clock showed 6 hours until their extraction window opened, giving them barely enough time to reach the convention center, locate the survivors, and fight their way back to the designated pickup zone. Failure meant joining the ranks of the infected or becoming their next meal, but success could provide the key to understanding and potentially reversing the outbreak that threatened to consume the entire continent. The team moved through the outer suburbs in a tight formation, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust and debris that had accumulated over months of abandonment. Madison used hand signals to direct their advance, drawing on her military experience to navigate the maze of abandoned vehicles and collapsed structures that littered the residential streets. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant sound of wind whistling through broken windows and the occasional creak of settling buildings. Every shadow could conceal a threat, every doorway might hide a pack of infected waiting to ambush unwary survivors. Jessica Williams found herself jumping at every unexpected sound, her teacher's instincts screaming that something was fundamentally wrong with this dead landscape where children should have been playing and families should have been living their normal lives. Dr. Rodriguez noticed the first signs of infected presence about 2 miles into their advance, pointing out scratch marks on car doors and walls that formed distinctive patterns the creatures used to mark their territory. The gouges were deep and deliberate, carved by fingernails that had grown thick and claw-like during the infection process. More disturbing were the bone fragments scattered around certain intersections, picked clean and arranged in small piles that suggested the infected had been feeding in organized groups rather than as individual scavengers. Intelligence reports had mentioned this behavior, but seeing the evidence firsthand sent chills through even the most experienced team members. The infected weren't just mindless predators anymore. They were developing social structures and territorial behaviors that made them far more dangerous than anyone had initially realized. Lisa Chen's knowledge of the area proved invaluable as she guided them through a series of back alleys and residential shortcuts that avoided the main thoroughfares where infected activity was most concentrated. Her police training had taught her to read urban environments for signs of danger, and she noticed subtle indicators that others might miss. Doors left ajar in specific patterns, windows broken from the inside rather than outside, and the absence of normal urban wildlife that would typically inhabit abandoned areas. The infected had claimed this territory so completely that even rats and stray dogs had fled or been consumed, leaving an ecological void that felt deeply unnatural. The detective's instincts told her they were being watched, though she couldn't pinpoint the source of her unease as they moved deeper into the infected zone. Maria Santos took point when they encountered their first major obstacle, a collapsed overpass that blocked their planned route toward downtown. The firefighters' expertise in structural assessment revealed that the bridge had been deliberately weakened, with support beams showing evidence of systematic damage rather than random destruction. The infected had learned to modify their environment, creating choke points and barriers that funneled survivors into predetermined killing zones. This level of strategic thinking represented a terrifying evolution in their capabilities, suggesting that some infected retained enough cognitive function to plan complex operations. The team was forced to backtrack and find an alternate route, adding precious time to their mission while increasing their exposure to potential detection. Jennifer Park's technical skills became crucial when they reached the outer edge of downtown, where the infected had somehow managed to trigger the city's emergency lockdown systems. Traffic lights flashed in chaotic patterns, emergency sirens wailed intermittently from hidden speakers, and electronic billboards displayed fragmented messages that seemed designed to confuse and disorient intruders. The software engineer realized that the infected had learned to manipulate the urban infrastructure, possibly through trial and error or by observing human survivors who had attempted similar tactics. She worked quickly to disable the most obvious electronic noise sources, but the damage was already done. Their presence had been announced to every infected creature within a several-mile radius, and the team could hear answering calls echoing from buildings throughout the downtown area. The first direct contact came without warning as they crossed a parking garage on the third floor, hoping to avoid street-level patrols. Patricia Johnson spotted movement in her peripheral vision just seconds before 3 infected burst from behind a concrete pillar, their movements unnaturally fast and coordinated. The former Army medic's training kicked in instantly as she raised her suppressed rifle and fired 3 precise shots, dropping the lead attacker before it could close the distance. Her teammates reacted with practiced efficiency, forming a defensive circle while scanning for additional threats. The infected had been lying in wait, demonstrating patience and tactical awareness that contradicted everything the military had told them about these creatures' supposed lack of higher brain function. Dr. Rodriguez examined the fallen infected while the others maintained security, noting physical changes that hadn't been documented in their briefing materials. The creature's muscle mass had increased significantly, their bone density appeared enhanced, and their sensory organs showed signs of adaptation that might explain their improved hunting abilities. Most disturbing was evidence of recent tool use, with one infected carrying a sharpened piece of rebar that had been deliberately modified into a crude spear. The surgeon's medical training told her that these weren't random mutations but systematic improvements that suggested the infection was still evolving, possibly in response to human countermeasures. The implications were staggering. If the infected could continue adapting at this rate, conventional military responses would become increasingly ineffective. Madison called for a brief tactical pause to reassess their situation as more infected calls echoed from the surrounding buildings. The team had covered less than half the distance to their objective, but they'd already encountered evidence that their intelligence was dangerously outdated. The infected weren't just surviving in the urban environment, they were thriving and evolving in ways that made them increasingly formidable opponents. Jessica Williams voiced what everyone was thinking when she whispered that maybe they should consider aborting the mission, but Madison knew that the survivors trapped in the convention center were counting on them. The research data they carried might be humanity's only hope of understanding and eventually defeating the infection, making retreat an unacceptable option despite the mounting evidence that they were walking into a trap far more sophisticated than anyone had imagined. The team pressed forward through the urban canyon of downtown Phoenix, where towering office buildings cast deep shadows that provided both concealment and countless hiding spots for potential ambushes. Madison noticed that the infected had modified the environment in subtle but significant ways, creating a network of elevated pathways using fire escapes, construction scaffolding, and improvised bridges made from debris. The creatures had essentially built a 3-dimensional hunting ground that allowed them to move above street level while maintaining visual contact with prey below. This level of environmental manipulation suggested not just intelligence but long-term planning capabilities that made every step forward increasingly dangerous. The team found themselves constantly looking up, down, and around corners as they navigated streets that had become elaborate killing fields designed by their inhuman adversaries. Jennifer Park's tablet displayed real-time updates from satellite imagery, revealing disturbing patterns of infected movement throughout the downtown area. Large groups were converging on their general location from multiple directions, moving with purpose rather than the random wandering that characterized early outbreak behavior. The software engineer's analysis suggested the infected were using some form of communication network, possibly through subsonic vocalizations or chemical signals that allowed them to coordinate complex group movements across vast distances. Her technical background helped her recognize that they were facing an enemy that had essentially created its own command and control structure, making traditional military tactics of divide and conquer largely ineffective against their collective intelligence. Dr. Rodriguez treated a minor injury that Jessica Williams sustained while climbing over a barricade of abandoned vehicles, but the brief medical stop revealed another unsettling discovery. The kindergarten teacher's small cut had attracted the attention of several infected who appeared from seemingly empty buildings, drawn by the scent of fresh blood from an impossible distance. The surgeon realized that the creature's sensory capabilities had been dramatically enhanced, allowing them to detect potential prey through smell, sound, and possibly other senses that humans couldn't fully comprehend. This explained how previous military units had been tracked and overwhelmed despite their training and equipment advantages. The infected weren't just physically superior, they possessed sensory abilities that made stealth and surprise nearly impossible to maintain. Lisa Chen's police instincts proved correct when she spotted the first organized infected patrol moving through the streets below their elevated position on a pedestrian bridge. The creatures moved in a formation that resembled military tactics, with scouts ranging ahead of the main group and rear guards protecting their flanks from potential threats. Most disturbing was their use of primitive weapons, including sharpened metal fragments, broken glass attached to handles, and even crude spears fashioned from construction materials. The detective counted at least 20 infected in the patrol, far more than their 8-person team could engage directly without risking catastrophic casualties. The infected had learned not just to hunt but to wage war, transforming from individual predators into organized military units. Maria Santos identified a potential route through the city's underground tunnel system, using her firefighters' knowledge of urban infrastructure to locate maintenance access points that might allow them to bypass the increasingly dangerous street-level patrols. The tunnel network included storm drains, utility corridors, and subway maintenance areas that could provide concealed movement toward their objective. However, the firefighters' experience also warned her that underground spaces could become death traps if the infected discovered their presence and blocked the exits. The team faced a critical decision: continue their exposed advance through streets controlled by organized infected patrols, or risk the unknown dangers of moving through confined underground spaces where escape options would be severely limited. The convention center loomed ahead like a fortress under siege, its glass facade reflecting the afternoon sun while revealing signs of the desperate battle that had taken place during the initial outbreak. Broken windows on the lower floors showed where the infected had attempted to breach the building, while intact barriers on the upper levels suggested that survivors had successfully fortified their position. Patricia Johnson's military experience helped her identify defensive positions and potential entry points, but she also recognized that any rescue attempt would require fighting through multiple layers of infected defenders who had likely established permanent positions around the building. The former Army medic estimated that hundreds of infected surrounded their objective, making extraction of survivors a nearly impossible task even if they managed to reach the upper floors. The team's communication equipment crackled with an unexpected transmission from the convention center survivors, confirming that people were still alive but reporting that their situation had deteriorated significantly since the last official contact. The survivors described coordinated attacks by infected groups that seemed to be testing their defenses systematically, probing for weaknesses while avoiding areas where they had previously suffered casualties. Most alarming was their report that some infected appeared to be learning from failed attacks, modifying their tactics and even using tools to overcome barriers that had previously stopped them. The survivors' leader, a security guard named Robert Martinez, warned that the infected seemed to be preparing for a final assault that would likely overwhelm their remaining defenses within hours. Madison realized that their mission had evolved from a simple rescue operation into a race against time to extract survivors before the infected launched what appeared to be a carefully planned final attack. The team's original extraction timeline was no longer viable, and they would need to accelerate their approach while somehow dealing with the organized infected forces that controlled the area around their objective. Jessica Williams suggested that they might be able to create a diversion to draw some of the infected away from the convention center, but Lisa Chen pointed out that their small team lacked the resources to mount an effective deception operation against enemies who had demonstrated sophisticated tactical awareness. The kindergarten teacher's courage was admirable, but they needed a strategy that acknowledged the reality of facing an enemy that had evolved far beyond their initial intelligence estimates. Dr. Rodriguez proposed using her medical knowledge to exploit potential weaknesses in the infected's enhanced physiology, suggesting that their improved physical capabilities might come with corresponding vulnerabilities that could be targeted with the right approach. The surgeon had noticed that the infected they'd encountered showed signs of accelerated metabolism and increased nutritional requirements, which might make them vulnerable to certain chemical compounds or environmental factors. However, testing such theories would require close observation of living infected specimens, a prospect that terrified even the most experienced team members. As they prepared for the final approach to the convention center, each woman understood that they were about to face an enemy that had transformed from mindless monsters into something far more dangerous, an organized, intelligent, and utterly ruthless force that had claimed the urban environment as its own hunting ground. The underground tunnel system proved to be a labyrinth of interconnected passages that stretched beneath the city like the veins of some massive organism. But Maria Santos navigated the darkness with the confidence of someone who had spent years studying urban infrastructure blueprints. Her flashlight beam revealed walls covered in strange markings that definitely hadn't been there before the outbreak, scratched symbols and patterns that suggested the infected had been using these tunnels as highways for months. The firefighters' expertise told her that the ventilation systems had been deliberately modified, with air shafts blocked or redirected in ways that created specific airflow patterns throughout the underground network. Most unsettling was the discovery of what appeared to be food storage areas where the infected had cached supplies, including items that could only have been obtained through systematic raiding of the surface world above. Jennifer Park's technical analysis of the tunnel modifications revealed a level of engineering sophistication that challenged everything they thought they knew about the infected's capabilities. The software engineer discovered that electrical systems had been rewired to create primitive but functional lighting in certain areas, suggesting that some infected retained enough technical knowledge to perform complex tasks. Her tablet's sensors detected unusual electromagnetic signatures throughout the tunnel network, possibly indicating that the infected had learned to use electronic devices or had developed some form of bioelectric communication system. The implications were staggering. If the infected could manipulate technology, then humanity's technological advantages might be far smaller than anyone had realized. Dr. Rodriguez made a disturbing discovery when they encountered the first infected corpse in the tunnels, a creature that appeared to have died from internal injuries rather than external trauma. Her medical examination revealed that the infected's enhanced physiology came with significant costs, including organ stress and metabolic imbalances that suggested their improved capabilities weren't sustainable long-term. However, the surgeon also found evidence of adaptive healing processes that allowed the infected to recover from injuries that would be fatal to normal humans. Most concerning was the presence of what appeared to be parasitic organisms in the creature's bloodstream, microscopic entities that might be responsible for the infection's continued evolution and the infected's enhanced abilities. Lisa Chen's police training helped her recognize territorial markers and patrol patterns as they moved deeper into the tunnel system, noting that the infected had established a complex hierarchy based on physical capabilities and hunting success. The detective observed that certain tunnels showed signs of heavy traffic while others remained virtually untouched, suggesting that the infected had developed preferred routes and restricted areas within their underground domain. Her analysis of scratch marks and other physical evidence indicated that the infected had been using these tunnels for coordinated attacks on surface targets, emerging at strategic locations to overwhelm isolated groups of survivors before retreating back to their subterranean stronghold. The team encountered their first major obstacle when they reached a section of tunnel that had been deliberately flooded, creating a water barrier that forced them to either turn back or find an alternative route through areas that showed heavy infected activity. Patricia Johnson's military experience suggested that the flooding was intentional, designed to channel intruders into specific areas where the infected could control the engagement. The former Army medic's tactical assessment revealed that they were being herded toward what appeared to be a kill zone, where multiple tunnel branches converged in a large chamber that would provide the infected with numerous attack vectors while limiting the team's escape options. Madison made the difficult decision to proceed through the flooded section despite the obvious risks, reasoning that their mission timeline didn't allow for extensive detours through areas that might be even more heavily defended. The water was chest-deep and ice-cold, forcing the team to move slowly while maintaining their weapons above the waterline, and watching for submerged obstacles or hidden threats. Jessica Williams struggled with the physical demands of wading through the flooded tunnel while carrying her equipment, but her determination to help the trapped survivors kept her moving forward despite her obvious exhaustion. The kindergarten teacher's courage inspired the other team members, reminding them that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when faced with impossible circumstances. The flooded section led to a vast underground chamber that had clearly been modified by the infected into some kind of central hub for their tunnel network operations. Maria Santos recognized the space as a former subway station that had been abandoned during construction decades earlier, but the infected had transformed it into something that resembled a primitive command center. Crude maps scratched into the walls showed surface locations throughout the city, with symbols that appeared to indicate successful hunting grounds, dangerous areas to avoid, and potential targets for future attacks. The firefighter's structural assessment revealed that the infected had reinforced certain areas while deliberately weakening others, creating a space that could be easily defended while providing multiple escape routes if necessary. Jennifer Park's analysis of the electronic equipment scattered throughout the chamber revealed that the infected had been collecting and modifying technology in ways that suggested they were attempting to restore some form of communication capability. The software engineer found evidence of jury-rigged radio equipment, modified cell phones, and even primitive computer terminals that had been connected to the city's fiber optic network. Most disturbing was the discovery of what appeared to be surveillance equipment that had been positioned to monitor key surface locations, including the convention center where the survivors were trapped. The infected weren't just hunting randomly. They were conducting organized intelligence-gathering operations that allowed them to track and target specific groups of survivors. Dr. Rodriguez's medical expertise helped her understand the biological samples that the infected had apparently been collecting and storing in the chamber, including blood, tissue, and other organic materials that suggested they were conducting some form of primitive research. The surgeon realized that the infected were studying their human prey, possibly trying to understand human physiology and behavior in order to become more effective predators. Most terrifying was the evidence that they had been experimenting with the infection itself, attempting to create new variants or enhance their existing capabilities through deliberate exposure to different biological agents. As the team prepared to leave the chamber and continue toward their objective, each member understood that they were facing an enemy that was not only intelligent and organized but actively working to become even more dangerous through systematic study and experimentation. The exit from the underground chamber led to a maintenance shaft that brought the team within 2 blocks of the convention center, but their emergence into daylight revealed a scene that defied their worst expectations. The infected had transformed the surrounding area into an elaborate siege works, with barricades, elevated platforms, and coordinated patrol routes that demonstrated military-level tactical planning. Madison observed through her binoculars that the creatures had established overlapping fields of fire around the convention center, positioning themselves to eliminate any rescue attempts while maintaining constant pressure on the survivors trapped inside. The former Marine sergeant realized that previous rescue missions hadn't failed due to bad luck or poor planning. They had walked into a carefully prepared killing ground designed by an enemy that understood modern warfare tactics better than anyone had imagined possible. Jessica Williams felt her teacher's protective instincts surge as she watched infected sentries methodically testing the convention center's defenses, probing windows and doors with tools and improvised weapons while others observed and took notes on crude writing materials. The kindergarten teacher recognized the systematic approach from her own classroom management experience, understanding that the infected were gathering data about their targets' capabilities and weaknesses before launching a coordinated assault. Her civilian perspective allowed her to see patterns that the military-trained team members might miss, noting that the infected were displaying patience and discipline that suggested they had learned to delay gratification in favor of more effective long-term strategies. Dr. Rodriguez used her medical training to analyze the infected's behavior patterns, noting that different groups seemed to specialize in specific roles within their siege operation. Some infected focused on construction and engineering tasks, building and maintaining the elaborate fortifications that surrounded the convention center, while others served as scouts, sentries, or assault specialists. The surgeon realized that the infection had somehow preserved or enhanced certain cognitive abilities while eliminating others, creating a population of specialized workers who could function as an organized military force. Most disturbing was her observation that the infected seemed to be learning and adapting in real time, modifying their tactics based on the survivors' responses to previous attacks. Lisa Chen's police experience helped her identify the command structure that the infected had established, with certain individuals clearly serving as leaders who directed the activities of larger groups through a combination of vocalizations, gestures, and physical positioning. The detective noticed that these leader-class infected were physically different from their subordinates, showing enhanced size, more sophisticated tool use, and behavioral patterns that suggested retained problem-solving abilities. Her analysis of their movement patterns revealed that the infected had established a complex hierarchy based on hunting success, tactical intelligence, and physical capabilities, creating a social structure that allowed them to coordinate large-scale operations across multiple locations simultaneously. Maria Santos assessed the structural modifications that the infected had made to the surrounding buildings, noting that they had created an interconnected network of elevated platforms, bridges, and tunnels that allowed rapid movement throughout their siege perimeter. The firefighters' expertise revealed that the infected had deliberately weakened certain structures while reinforcing others, creating controlled collapse zones that could be triggered to block escape routes or eliminate threats. Most concerning was her discovery that the infected had tapped into the building's utility systems, gaining access to electrical power, water, and communication networks that enhanced their operational capabilities far beyond what anyone had anticipated. The team's observation post provided a clear view of the convention center's upper floors, where survivors could be seen moving behind barricaded windows and makeshift defensive positions. Patricia Johnson's military training allowed her to assess the survivors' defensive capabilities, noting that they had established overlapping fields of fire and coordinated patrol schedules that suggested at least some military or law enforcement experience among their leadership. However, the former Army medic also recognized signs of fatigue, resource depletion, and declining morale that indicated the survivors were approaching the limits of their endurance. The infected siege tactics were working, slowly wearing down the defenders' physical and psychological resistance while preparing for a final assault that would overwhelm their remaining capabilities. Jennifer Park's technical analysis revealed that the infected had somehow gained access to the convention center's security systems, using the building's own surveillance cameras and communication networks to monitor the survivors' activities and defensive preparations. The software engineer discovered that the creatures had learned to manipulate electronic systems with surprising sophistication, possibly through trial and error or by observing human survivors who had attempted similar tactics during the early stages of the siege. Most alarming was her detection of what appeared to be coordinated cyber attacks against the survivors' remaining electronic equipment, suggesting that some infected retained enough technical knowledge to conduct information warfare alongside their physical assault operations. Madison realized that any rescue attempt would require neutralizing the infected's command and control capabilities before attempting to extract the survivors, but the enemy's distributed leadership structure made traditional decapitation strikes nearly impossible. The team would need to create multiple simultaneous diversions while somehow penetrating the infected's defensive perimeter and reaching the convention center's upper floors without triggering the coordinated response that had destroyed previous rescue attempts. Dr. Rodriguez suggested that they might be able to exploit the infected's enhanced sensory capabilities by creating overwhelming stimuli that would disrupt their coordination, but such tactics would also alert every infected creature within miles to their presence. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the siege perimeter as the team prepared for what they all understood might be a suicide mission, but the sight of survivors desperately signaling from the convention center's upper floors reminded them that failure meant condemning innocent people to a horrible death. Jessica Williams volunteered to create the primary diversion, arguing that her civilian status might allow her to approach closer to the infected positions before being detected, but Madison refused to sacrifice any team member unnecessarily. As they finalized their assault plan, each woman understood that they were about to face an enemy that had evolved far beyond humanity's ability to comprehend, let alone defeat, but the alternative was abandoning the survivors to creatures that had transformed urban warfare into an art form designed specifically to hunt and eliminate the last remnants of human civilization. The assault began at precisely 1,600 hours when Jennifer Park triggered a series of coordinated electronic disruptions throughout the infected siege network, using her technical expertise to overload their improvised communication systems and create cascading failures in their surveillance equipment. The software engineer had identified critical nodes in the infected's electronic infrastructure, targeting power junctions and data relays that would blind their coordination capabilities while creating enough electromagnetic interference to mask the team's approach. Her cyber warfare tactics proved devastatingly effective as infected sentries throughout the perimeter began displaying signs of confusion and disorientation, their carefully maintained formation dissolving into chaos as their command structure struggled to adapt to the sudden loss of technological advantages they had grown dependent upon. Madison led the primary assault team through a gap in the infected's defensive line that opened when their electronic coordination failed, moving with the precision and speed that had made her one of the Marine Corps' most decorated non-commissioned officers. The former sergeant's tactical expertise allowed her to exploit the brief window of opportunity created by Jennifer's electronic attack, leading Jessica Williams and Dr. Rodriguez through a series of abandoned storefronts toward the convention center's main entrance. Behind them, Lisa Chin and Maria Santos established overwatch positions that would provide covering fire during the extraction phase, while Patricia Johnson prepared medical stations for treating wounded survivors during what promised to be a chaotic evacuation under fire. Jessica Williams surprised everyone, including herself, by demonstrating remarkable courage and tactical awareness as she moved through the urban battlefield alongside the military-trained team members. The kindergarten teacher's civilian perspective proved invaluable when she spotted infected ambush positions that the others had missed, her experience managing unpredictable children translating unexpectedly well to anticipating the erratic behavior patterns of creatures that retained just enough human intelligence to be dangerous. Her crossbow skills, developed during weeks of intensive training, allowed her to eliminate several infected sentries silently while the team advanced toward their objective, proving that determination and proper preparation could overcome the disadvantages of civilian background. Dr. Rodriguez's medical expertise became crucial when they encountered their first group of wounded survivors who had been trapped on the convention center's lower floors for days without adequate medical attention. The surgeon worked with practiced efficiency to stabilize critical injuries while the team established a defensive perimeter, her trauma surgery experience allowing her to perform life-saving procedures under combat conditions that would have challenged even experienced military medics. Most of the survivors were suffering from dehydration, malnutrition, and infected wounds, but several had sustained serious injuries during previous infected attacks that required immediate surgical intervention to prevent fatal complications. The convention center's interior had been transformed into a maze of barricades, defensive positions, and improvised shelters that reflected months of desperate survival efforts by people who had never expected to become urban warfare specialists. Maria Santos used her firefighter's knowledge of building layouts to navigate the complex internal structure, identifying structural weaknesses and potential collapse hazards while locating the most defensible positions for consolidating survivors during the extraction process. Her expertise proved essential when they discovered that the infected had been systematically weakening the building's support structures, apparently planning to bring down entire sections once they launched their final assault. Lisa Chen's police training helped her establish communication with the surviving security personnel who had been coordinating the convention center's defense, learning that the situation was far more desperate than their intelligence had indicated. The detective discovered that the survivors had been reduced to fewer than 30 people from an original group of over 200, with most casualties resulting from coordinated infected attacks that had systematically eliminated anyone with military or law enforcement experience. The remaining survivors included mostly civilians with limited combat training, making evacuation even more challenging since they would require constant protection during movement through hostile territory. Patricia Johnson's military medical experience proved invaluable when she assessed the survivors' psychological condition, recognizing signs of severe trauma and combat stress that could compromise their ability to follow evacuation procedures under pressure. The former army medic worked quickly to identify individuals who might panic or freeze during the extraction, developing contingency plans for managing civilian behavior during what would inevitably be a terrifying journey through infected-controlled territory. Her assessment revealed that several survivors were suffering from severe psychological breaks that made them potential liabilities during evacuation, requiring difficult decisions about who could be safely moved and who might need to be sedated for transport. The team's extraction plan required moving the survivors through a series of predetermined waypoints while maintaining communication with their overwatched positions and avoiding the infected patrols that were already beginning to reorganize after the initial electronic disruption. Jennifer Park's technical skills allowed her to restore limited communication capabilities using the convention center's backup systems, but she warned that their electronic advantage would be temporary since the infected had demonstrated remarkable adaptability in previous encounters. The software engineer estimated they had perhaps 30 minutes before the infected's command structure fully recovered and began coordinating a massive counterattack designed to prevent any survivors from escaping their carefully maintained siege perimeter. Madison realized that their original extraction timeline was completely unrealistic given the number of wounded survivors and the infected's rapid adaptation to their assault tactics, but abandoning people was not an option she could accept. The former Marine sergeant made the difficult decision to split the team, with half the members beginning immediate evacuation of the most critically wounded, while the others remained to defend the convention center until additional rescue assets could be brought forward. Dr. Rodriguez volunteered to stay with the wounded who couldn't be moved immediately, knowing that her medical expertise might be the difference between life and death for people who had already survived months of unimaginable horror. As infected howls began echoing throughout the downtown area, signaling the beginning of a coordinated counterattack, each team member understood that their mission had evolved from rescue to last stand, with the survival of 30 innocent people depending on their ability to hold defensive positions against an enemy that had spent months preparing for exactly this scenario. The infected counterattack began with a coordinated assault from multiple directions that demonstrated their evolution into a sophisticated military force capable of complex tactical operations. Madison watched through her rifle scope as waves of infected emerged from concealed positions throughout the downtown area, moving with the disciplined precision of veteran soldiers rather than the chaotic mob behavior that had characterized early outbreak encounters. The former Marine sergeant counted at least 300 infected converging on the convention center from predetermined attack vectors, their movements coordinated by leader-class infected who directed the assault through a combination of vocalizations and tactical positioning that suggested months of careful planning and preparation. Jessica Williams found herself defending a critical choke point on the convention center's second floor, her crossbow proving surprisingly effective against infected attackers who had learned to use body armor and improvised shields during their siege operations. The kindergarten teacher's civilian background actually provided advantages in the urban combat environment, as her lack of formal military training allowed her to think creatively about defensive tactics that confused infected attackers who had apparently studied and adapted to conventional military responses. Her position overlooked the main entrance where Dr. Rodriguez was coordinating the evacuation of wounded survivors, making her accuracy with the crossbow essential for protecting the medical operation that represented their only hope of saving lives. Dr. Rodriguez worked frantically to stabilize the most critically wounded survivors while infected attackers pressed closer to their defensive perimeter, her surgical skills tested by the need to perform life-saving procedures under combat conditions that would have challenged even the most experienced battlefield medics. The surgeon had established a makeshift operating theater in the convention center's main lobby, using supplies scavenged from the building's first aid stations and her own medical kit to treat injuries ranging from infected bites to severe trauma wounds sustained during previous attacks. Most challenging were the psychological casualties, survivors who had suffered complete mental breaks and required sedation or physical restraint to prevent them from compromising the evacuation operation. Lisa Chin coordinated the defensive positions from her Overwatch location in a nearby office building, using her police training to direct covering fire and identify priority targets among the infected assault forces. The detective's urban combat experience proved invaluable as she recognized tactical patterns in the infected's attack, noting that they had learned to use suppressing fire, flanking maneuvers, and coordinated rushes that mimicked professional military tactics. Most disturbing was her observation that the infected were deliberately targeting team members with apparent leadership roles, suggesting they understood the importance of command and control in human military operations and were actively working to decapitate the rescue team's organizational structure. Maria Santos used her firefighters' expertise to create defensive obstacles and escape routes throughout the convention center, employing her knowledge of building systems to flood certain areas, trigger fire suppression systems, and even cause controlled structural collapses that channeled infected attackers into predetermined kill zones. The firefighters' understanding of urban infrastructure allowed her to turn the building itself into a weapon, using electrical systems to create barriers, water systems to slow infected advances, and even the building's public address system to create acoustic confusion that disrupted the infected's coordination efforts. Her innovations bought precious time for the evacuation operation, but she knew that the building's systems would eventually fail under the sustained assault. Patricia Johnson established a casualty collection point where she triaged wounded survivors and team members, her military medical training allowing her to make the difficult decisions about who could be saved and who was beyond help in their current circumstances. The former Army medic had seen similar situations during her deployment overseas, but fighting infected attackers who showed no fear, felt no pain, and never retreated presented challenges that exceeded even her combat experience. Most frustrating was treating survivors who had been infected during the assault, requiring immediate decisions about quarantine procedures and the horrible possibility of having to eliminate people they had risked their lives to save. Jennifer Park's technical expertise became crucial when the infected began using their own electronic warfare capabilities to disrupt the team's communication and coordination systems, forcing her into a cyber battle that played out simultaneously with the physical assault on the convention center. The software engineer discovered that the infected had learned to jam radio frequencies, overload electronic systems, and even use the building's own security systems against the defenders, turning surveillance cameras into targeting devices and using the public address system to coordinate their attacks. Her counter-cyber operations required constant adaptation as the infected demonstrated remarkable learning capabilities, modifying their electronic tactics in real time to overcome her defensive measures. The evacuation operation proceeded in stages, with the most critically wounded survivors being moved first through a series of predetermined routes that avoided the heaviest infected concentrations while maintaining communication with overwatch positions that provided covering fire. Madison coordinated the movement using hand signals and short-range radio communications, but the infected's electronic warfare capabilities made coordination increasingly difficult as the battle progressed. Each group of evacuees required escort by armed team members, reducing the defensive capabilities of those remaining in the convention center while increasing the risk to both rescuers and survivors during movement through hostile territory. The infected's assault reached its climax when leader-class infected began directing coordinated attacks against the convention center's structural supports, apparently attempting to bring down the entire building rather than allow any survivors to escape their carefully maintained siege perimeter. Dr. Rodriguez made the agonizing decision to abandon several critically wounded survivors who couldn't be moved safely, focusing her medical efforts on those who had the best chance of surviving the evacuation process. As the building began showing signs of structural failure and infected attackers breached the main defensive perimeter, Madison realized that their rescue mission had become a desperate fighting withdrawal where success would be measured not by the number of people saved, but by how many team members survived to fight another day. The infected had evolved beyond humanity's ability to defeat them through conventional means, transforming urban warfare into a nightmare scenario where the hunters had become the hunted, and civilization's last defenders found themselves outmatched by an enemy that had learned to wage war with inhuman patience and terrifying intelligence. The final evacuation became a desperate running battle through the streets of downtown Phoenix as the convention center collapsed behind them in a thunderous cascade of concrete and steel, the infected's systematic destruction of the building's support structures proving devastatingly effective in eliminating their defensive stronghold. Madison led the surviving team members and rescued civilians through a gauntlet of infected attackers who had positioned themselves along every possible escape route, their coordination so precise that it seemed impossible these creatures had once been mindless predators driven only by hunger. The former Marine sergeant's tactical expertise was pushed to its absolute limits, as she tried to outmaneuver an enemy that had spent months studying human military tactics and developing countermeasures specifically designed to eliminate organized resistance. Jessica Williams carried a wounded child survivor on her back while maintaining her crossbow-ready position, the kindergarten teacher's maternal instincts overriding her fear as she fought to protect the innocent lives that depended on their successful extraction. Her civilian perspective had proven invaluable throughout the mission, allowing her to think outside conventional military doctrine and find creative solutions to tactical problems that had stumped more experienced fighters. The teacher's courage inspired the other survivors, many of whom were on the verge of psychological collapse after months of siege conditions and the trauma of watching their sanctuary destroyed by creatures that had once been their neighbors, friends, and family members. Dr. Rodriguez performed emergency medical procedures while moving through hostile territory, her surgical skills tested by the need to treat life-threatening injuries without proper equipment or sterile conditions while under constant threat of attack. The surgeon had made the heartbreaking decision to leave behind several critically wounded survivors who couldn't survive the evacuation journey, but she was determined that those who had made it this far would receive every possible chance of survival. Her medical expertise had revealed disturbing evidence that the infection was continuing to evolve, with newer infected showing enhanced physical capabilities and improved coordination that suggested the outbreak was far from reaching its final form. Lisa Chin used her police training to coordinate the fighting withdrawal, directing covering fire and identifying safe routes through the urban battlefield while maintaining communication with their extraction points several miles away. The detective's analysis of infected behavior patterns had proven crucial throughout the mission, but she was deeply troubled by evidence that the creatures were learning from each encounter and sharing that knowledge across their entire population through unknown communication methods. Her law enforcement experience told her that they were facing an enemy that combined the worst aspects of organized crime, terrorist networks, and military forces into something that exceeded humanity's ability to comprehend or counter effectively. Maria Santos employed her firefighters' knowledge of urban infrastructure to create obstacles and diversions that slowed the infected pursuit, using her understanding of building systems to trigger controlled explosions, flood certain areas, and even cause power grid failures that disrupted the infected's coordination efforts. The firefighters' expertise had been essential in navigating the complex urban environment, but she recognized that the infected were rapidly adapting to human countermeasures and would soon develop responses to the tactics that had proven effective during this mission. Her structural engineering knowledge warned her that the infected's systematic destruction of key buildings was part of a larger strategy to deny humans any defensible positions within their claimed territory. Patricia Johnson treated wounded team members and survivors while maintaining her combat effectiveness, the former Army medic's battlefield experience allowing her to function under pressure that would have incapacitated less experienced personnel. Her medical assessment of the team's condition revealed that they were all suffering from exhaustion, dehydration, and various injuries that would require immediate attention once they reached safety, but she was most concerned about the psychological trauma that would affect everyone who had witnessed the infected's terrifying evolution into an organized military force. The medic's combat experience had prepared her for many horrors, but fighting an enemy that retained human intelligence while losing all human compassion presented challenges that exceeded even her extensive training. Jennifer Park maintained their electronic countermeasures while coordinating with extraction assets, her technical expertise proving crucial for maintaining communication links and preventing the infected from using their own electronic warfare capabilities to disrupt the evacuation operation. The software engineer's analysis of the infected's technological adaptations had revealed that they were not just using existing systems, but actually improving and modifying technology in ways that suggested retained engineering knowledge among certain infected individuals. Her cyber warfare efforts had bought them precious time during the mission, but she warned that the infected's learning capabilities meant that similar electronic tactics would be far less effective in future encounters. The extraction point was a heavily fortified military checkpoint where helicopter assets waited to evacuate the survivors and team members, but reaching it required crossing several miles of infected-controlled territory while protecting civilians who lacked combat training or experience. Madison's tactical assessment revealed that they were being herded toward the extraction point by infected forces that seemed to understand their destination and were positioning themselves to launch a final ambush that would eliminate both the rescue team and the survivors they had fought so hard to save. The former Marine sergeant realized that the infected strategic thinking had evolved to the point where they were conducting complex military operations that rivaled anything she had encountered during her service overseas. As the team approached the final checkpoint with their precious cargo of survivors, each member understood that their mission had revealed a terrifying truth about humanity's future in a world dominated by creatures that had retained the best aspects of human intelligence while discarding the moral constraints that had once limited human warfare. The infected had evolved beyond simple predators into something that represented an existential threat to human civilization, possessing the organizational capabilities to wage systematic war against the remaining human population while continuously adapting and improving their tactics based on each encounter. Dr. Rodriguez's medical analysis suggested that the infection would continue evolving, potentially creating even more dangerous variants that could threaten humanity's survival on a global scale. The successful rescue of 30 survivors from the Phoenix Convention Center represented both a tactical victory and a strategic warning that conventional military responses would be inadequate against an enemy that had learned to wage war with inhuman patience, terrifying intelligence, and the absolute ruthlessness that came from viewing humans as nothing more than prey to be hunted, studied, and eventually eliminated from territories they now claimed as their own hunting grounds.